You're listening to Beyond The Endpoint, a podcast from the Duke Clinical Research Institute. In this series, we're demystifying clinical research and answering your pressing questions about health and healthcare. You can find our full episodes at dcri.org/BTE.
2 weeks ago, our guest shared a powerful firsthand account of her journey as a clinical research participant and finding a clinical trial that helped save her life following her cancer diagnosis. Now we're zooming out to speak to someone who spends a lot of time working directly with a lot of clinical trial participants to understand some of the broader themes and participant perspectives and how we answer some of their common questions. Welcome back to Beyond the Endpoint. I'm Dr. Manesh Patel. I'm the chief of the Division of Cardiology and Clinical Pharmacology here at Duke. I'm joined here today by my co-host and fellow DCRI member, Dr. Emily O'Brien, an associate professor of population health sciences and neurology at Duke.
Thanks, Manesh. Good to be here with you today. So today's discussion is actually going to be the second half of a two-part series that we're doing on why people participate in clinical research. Last time we heard from Katie Ortman-Doble, a stage 4 cancer survivor who credits her participation in a clinical trial with saving her life. Today, you're going to be speaking with Krista Camuglia, who's a research practice manager here at the Duke Heart Center Clinical Research Unit.
Krista is great. I'm so excited we have her. You know, as a young faculty member, I was learning how to do clinical research and started working with Krista. And so we've worked for a long time. And, you know, I think hopefully she'll give you a behind the curtain look at how we approach the work of clinical research and how we engage people in thinking about being a participant in clinical research.
So before we get into your discussion with Krista today, I'm wondering if you could connect the dots a little bit for our audience. So you and I, we're really in the trenches. We spend a lot of our working hours thinking about research. And I think you have to be pretty committed to the mission in order to get up and do that every day, day in and day out. Tell us why you think it's important for the audience to hear perspectives, both from people who do clinical research as a job and clinical research participants themselves.
Emily, thanks for that question. I mean, I could think of maybe no better time to have a conversation about the importance of research and why it may matter. In fact, I think the term research for a lot of my patients and some of my colleagues, even like my family at times, sounds like an esoteric thing. And so I try to break it down. Research is just us trying to learn and do better for the next group of people. And sometimes the way we do that learning requires us to do really specific things. Importantly, we want to first make sure people who we're working with have the opportunity to know what the risks and benefits of being in a research study are. But additionally, they understand what they could contribute to the knowledge. In fact, I think one of the best things about our country over the last 50 years has been our research infrastructure that has brought tremendous innovations to health and other industries. You know, as a clinician, physician, and as a scientist, I hope that we are not only taking care of people and learning how to deliver better health, but we're learning all the time. And part of that means you have to have a team and a team of people that can describe what a research study is, make sure people are consented, agreeing to wanting to be in it, especially when it's a clinical trial. And then importantly, getting all the information and using it in a meaningful way. So it's designing, it's thinking about it. And as our podcast says, it's getting beyond the endpoint. It's figuring out what does it really mean for people's lives.
Yeah, thanks, Manesh. So fully agree. I mean, I think this is a great time for all of us to kind of take a step back and say, why do we do this and how does it really contribute? And I think one of the common sort of misconceptions that I hear from like friends and family when we're talking about, my job and what it is that we do in clinical research is that it's just drug trials. So there's some new medication and we need to test it in a bunch of people to make sure that people aren't, dying early or going to the hospital with a bunch of problems and that the drug actually works as intended. We've seen a big growth at the DCRI in implementation science and the use of real world evidence and screening studies and safety studies. For our listeners, could you give an overview of these various types and the different ways that people could contribute to research beyond just the classic drug trial?
Yeah, for sure. Let me just first start with what I'll call the classic drug trial, right? I think it's important for people to understand that for us to really bring therapies, even to study existing or old therapies, we sometimes have to do these trials where we give these therapies to patients that are generally similar and see if they do better or not. In fact, this set of research is often called interventional studies, studies where we intervene. We give one half or one group something that we may not give the other group, or we do some intervention and see how people do. Classically, as you said, that can be a drug or a device. And often it's done to both see if that drug or device works, if it's safe and people have a benefit. And there's a lot of value in those trials because one can imagine, just like our guest last time, Katie, when you have a cancer and you're trying to get into a trial because you're looking for a therapy that might treat your condition, there's a huge drive. But that is an important part, but not by any stretch, as you said, all of the research that happens. In fact, much of the research that happens aims to make sure what we think these therapies or patterns of care are delivering are actually what happens. As you highlighted, I'll call it sort of real world studies or observational studies, studies that we follow patients and ensure that the care we're giving them or the therapies they're getting have the intended effects that we saw in other research. So it's surveillance studies that make sure people are getting safe, high quality outcomes. There's also implementation science, as you highlighted, and that's a fancy word for how do we get things into practice? What's the best way to make sure that the patient gets access to care, gets their blood pressure down, and has a better quality of life? That may be a drug, but it also may be implementing a new diet, pathway of care, exercise, a variety of things. So those are all forms of research. And I think the key that you'll hear from Krista here in a second is that the structure of research is often involves a principal investigator, a physician, a clinician, a scientist who's interested in evaluating the data, doing epidemiology, doing population health research. And then people like Krista, who are clinical research coordinators or leaders that interact with making sure we're regulatorily compliant. I really look forward to having her tell us a little bit about how we do it.
Yeah, I think so often, you pick up a news story about a study or you go to a scientific meeting and you hear the PI or principal investigator describe the study and the major findings. And every PI would acknowledge that none of those findings would be possible without a much larger team that includes the participants themselves, as well as people like Krista, who are really responsible for overseeing the day-to-day of the work and making sure that all the important components get done so that the data can be generated in a robust way and we can get answers to the questions that are most important to people.
Yeah, so let's get into it. Chris is going to provide, I think, a really enlightening perspective for anyone who wants to know more about what clinical participation looks like and what it's all for. Thanks, Krista, for joining us today for Beyond the Endpoint.
Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to have you here, and I know we've worked together for several years now. I think we started doing work together when I was quite a bit younger and doing research in our cath lab, probably in the early to mid-2000s. You were a clinical research coordinator when we were doing that, and now you're helping run our practice. Can you tell us, to those that may not be aware, what does a clinical research coordinator do for people?
Sure. So a clinical research coordinator is a person that basically coordinates the research study from recruiting participants and following a protocol and getting participants in the study, being a main point of contact for participants, helping with conducting the different tests and procedures or questionnaires in a research study, and following up and making sure that the data is collected and appropriate for statistical analysis.
I think about a clinical research coordinator almost as like a point guard or a quarterback for that patient during clinical research, a partner for the clinical team, the physician, the team that's taking care of the patient. The coordinator working with the physician often is making sure that the patient understands all the parts of the research, the risks and benefits, and then helps carry out the protocol the way that each protocol may be different. And in your experience, I'm sure there are times when this is rewarding because you get to really know the participants or patients and they come to value that interaction and you help them through a protocol, which is a really important part. And potentially, reflecting on Katie Ortman-Dobel's story, how does her experience line up with trials that we conduct? Her story is very specific. So how is it similar to some things we do and how might it be different?
Sure. So Katie's story is very similar to some of our rare disease populations that we do in the Heart Center. It's a very specific disease where, that's the only option or treatment option that someone might have. But we also have other research studies in which it's different from Katie's story, where it's maybe not as critical or as, only option type studies, but more other studies that we're just trying to help improve science and research.
Yeah, it gets to, how we help people. I think that the idea that you might have a condition where there are other therapies in it, whether it's a cancer or a heart condition or another endocrine, whatever health condition, that you want to find a therapy that may be very specific for you is really valuable. At the other side of it, you might have a very common thing, as you said, high blood pressure, diabetes, and there are lots of different ways that therapies might be used, and so people might be thinking about that. Or you might need to go through different types of procedures. And, it takes me from her story to another concept, which is high stakes or low stakes participation. So if somebody's thinking about it being in a study, how do we think about high stakes or low stakes?
Sure. So high stakes participation is exactly that, where maybe there is no other treatment option, or maybe it's an invasive procedure in which you're getting a new type of surgery or a new treatment that's never been done before or has been done, but we're still working through making sure that it's safe for participants. And then with low stakes research, that's more just trying to ensure that we're still collecting knowledge and data. It could be questionnaires or it could be other things, but it's not as much life or death for a specific disease population, but more generalized.
So what's your pitch? Why participate in a clinical research study?
So when I'm talking to a participant about a research study, I really tell them the value of helping others by participating in a research study. They're able to help others in a way by advancing scientific knowledge, by providing, hopefully, information to help new medical therapies come to light in future research.
Yeah, I think that's a key altruistic piece that everybody wants. And I would say often in the low stakes kinds of research we talk about, where we want to use your information or we want to learn something from you and we think that the risk to you will be low, that's a really valuable opportunity, because people in the high stakes, sometimes they're willing to participate even in therapy that doesn't directly change their outcome. We don't know if it will or not, that it adds to the knowledge. The other piece people sometimes ask about, Krista, and I wonder about, is what about the benefit to me? What do I get if I participate in clinical research? How do you frame that for them?
What I normally say is if it's a medical therapy or a disease process that the research study is looking at, there may be a direct medical benefit to you, even if the study is unsuccessful or may not be beneficial to you. We're hoping that the information we gather will be beneficial in the future.
Yeah, and a lot of people might say, what exactly does unsuccessful mean? And often we're studying one therapy compared to another, or a procedure or a device or other things. And when we think about it, we might say, well, that didn't incrementally change outcomes that people might care about. Endpoints is kind of our podcast, right? Do I feel better? Do I walk better? Do I live better? Do I have things that make me feel better? And sometimes the things in the study might not do that. But I highlight for our participants that being in a study, looking at lots of studies, the people that participate in studies tend to do better in some of those other aspects. They tend to have better health courses or life courses. They learn. They know more about their heart failure. They know about their cancer, or just everyday things like walking and blood pressure and diabetes. So I think there are opportunities or benefits that are clear that may not be obvious when people are participating in trials. But the other side of the coin, we certainly hear about people that say, I don't want to participate, and they may not want to participate for several reasons. One of them is distrust. I'm not sure that the science is well vetted, or I'm not sure I understand that. How do you respond to that?
I normally respond that research studies just don't appear out of the blue because someone had an idea. There is a large vetting process where someone has an idea. It goes to an institutional review board, among other ethics committees and things like that review the study prior to it ever getting to a participant being asked to be part of the study.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. There are some basic tenets people should know about how clinical research is conducted. The first is that there has to be the potential for benefit, and we have to be able to describe it to an institutional review board so that when we go through the informed consent process, we can say, hey, here's the possible benefit, here are the possible risks. We think the benefits may outweigh the risks in this therapy, and that's why. And the reason we think that is for these reasons. Another thing people think about sometimes is they say, I don't want to be a guinea pig. I want the stuff that works, Dr. Patel. I'm not sure I want to participate in research. And how do you respond to that?
For the guinea pig comment, I usually talk about how it's not that we're just doing research that you don't know about. We are absolutely 100% making you aware in that informed consent document and process that you mentioned earlier, that we are going through and sharing everything that we would be doing in the research studies. So you are very much knowledgeable and aware of what would be happening and what the possible benefits might be, but also, the potential risks as well.
And, as a clinician that works with some of the patients sometimes, I like to ensure they know that they're going to get the best care that we know of.
They're going to get all the care I give everyone else usually in these protocols. In fact, we try not to do research where we're saying, hey, we're not going to do what's the standard of care. Now, there might be one part that is the study part where we do something different, and that's the part we want to talk about. But all the other care has to be as good as we can, and that's an important piece to get across. One of the things I saw and heard in Katie's description was, and I see all the time, is just how complex it is for people who want to participate in research, having to go to different places, cost, barriers to finding the right study. So what are the kinds of things we're doing to hopefully improve the experience of people who want to be or might consider being in clinical research?
Sure. So I'm sure every institution is different, but I know there is a big push to have research studies going in more rural areas in the country and also allowing other technologies to be used, whether if participants can't travel to clinics or things like that, we can use remote opportunities like Zoom and virtual visits and things like that to help. Also from a cost perspective, if participants do travel to come in and be in the research study at the clinic, most studies offer participant reimbursement to help with travel and food and just time.
Yeah, those are really important. Last couple things that we want to make sure we close the loop on is how do we get information back to participants? Are there sort of principles that we abide by?
At the end of the study, we do get the analytical results, and as a research coordinator, we try to make sure and provide that information, if possible, to the research participants in the study. There's also results found on clinicaltrials.gov if you want a more scientific approach to reading the results of the study. And then also just during the course of the study, when we are able to share information with participants that's allowed during a protocol, we certainly try to do that.
Yeah, we certainly enjoy actually sharing the results, whatever they may be. We sort of talked again about successful, unsuccessful. You know, what people often care about is which one did I get? Did I get the therapy or not? That's one. The second one I think I hear a lot about is, was the study, did it show a big benefit? Well, you know, what's really interesting is sometimes even when the study hasn't shown a big benefit, some of the people who are taken care of have had a big benefit, it looks like, and they've been on the therapy. So we have to look at 1,000 people sometimes to see if there's a difference, but some individuals might be seeing some differences. So we often come back and show them the results or tell them. We often also generate a page or document that's very understandable and not scientific language to say, here's what we found, and make sure people understand that. I'll just say that it's been exciting to go over the clinical trial process. Like a lot of things in life, this is about relationships. And so I might end by asking you, Krista, why do you do it? What joy do you get out of being a clinical researcher?
As a nurse previously, I was in the medical field, and I really find joy in this new career move being in clinical research because I get to, I feel like, help more people and help advance technology and hope that the work that I do helps people get the treatments and therapies that they need.
Yeah, you know, in a lot of things in life, it's about the relationships we have, the people we get to work with, and the things we get to do. And I enjoy working with you, and I enjoy being part of the place where people get to feel like they could potentially help others with their own participation. So I really want to thank you for being part of this, and I hope everyone who's jogging or riding in the car or listening to our podcast, wherever you may be, found some value in how we think about clinical research.
Thanks again for having me.
Hey, Manesh, so that was a great discussion. I want to address something that we alluded to in our prior interview with Katie and in our interview with Krista. And that's why people might hesitate to participate in research. So obviously, you and I are believers. We sort of know the process in and out. But people may wonder why that is, or they might say, oh, it's easy for you. You're sort of in charge of the research. You're not a participant yourself. And I know you've previously talked about how people really don't like the idea of being a test subject or a guinea pig, so to speak. So anecdotally, like as you've interacted with participants and people in your clinic, other folks who've been involved in your research, what are some of the reasons that you've heard about why people might hesitate to be part of a study?
It's a little bit like all of us, right? Like he's 20 now, but my son, when he was little, had a nut allergy with like 1 or 2. And my wife and I, we spent a lot of time when he was little thinking about this peanut allergy. And there was a set of studies that were coming out to potentially desensitize kids. So one of the reasons we wanted to be in a study was because you might get access to something that might help your child in the future. And we went to several sort of visits and learned about the study, but we never ended up doing it. We are now working through at age 20, like it's now approved and he still has an allergy, carries an EpiPen. One thing I share with patients all the time is it gets you access to new things. But others do worry, like, am I going to get the same care That's another really common question. Like, if I'm in the study, am I still going to get all the good stuff that we're supposed to be doing today? And what I often tell people is that most of these studies are on top of best available care. And in fact, when doctors and patients are engaged in research, they're just much more engaged, and they likely, I think, have better outcomes. In fact, we've seen, as I think you and I have highlighted on other programs, there is a placebo effect. I was one of the investigators in HTN3, which was a randomized trial of renal denervation, a procedure where we would go into someone's kidney artery and actually do a procedure to try to prevent and interrupt the nerves from the brain and the kidney so that they might have lower blood pressure. And these are people on 2 or 3 medicines with still high blood pressure. And so we talked to 700, 800 patients and found 20, 30 such patients that were eligible, met criteria, and did the study. And this several hundred patient study actually randomized people to get the procedure. But the other group also went to the cath lab. They didn't know they were not getting the procedure. We gave them some medicines. They knew this was going to be it. And they would actually get a tube in the artery, and that we would do a sham procedure. The reason for them to be in the study is at the end of the study, if this therapy worked, they would be the first to get access to it. Well, lo and behold, what we found out is by being observed, by making sure they all took their medicines and they did all the things they're supposed to, or just by being in the study, their blood pressure came down 12 millimeters of mercury when they didn't even get the procedure versus 14 for the group that did. So there's a little bit more for the procedural group, but it was the power of the placebo, power being in a clinical trial. And those patients' blood pressure over time likely did better. I think the last reason people tell me is like, what's in it, not just for me, how do I help others? And we often say that by sharing this information and helping us learn will hopefully help others, which I think Krista highlighted in our conversation.
Yeah, that's a great summary, Manesh. So I would also say that the Hawthorne effect that you described, where outcomes can improve just because you're being observed, that one is pretty durable. I mean, we've seen that so frequently across all sorts of disease areas, therapeutic domains. So it's certainly not a guaranteed benefit, but it's one that shows up. Sounds like one of the important components of this process. Like, how do I get a better understanding of what those benefits and risks are, because they're going to be different for different people, right? The PI and the research staff are, really the experts in common sort of risks and benefits, but they're really there as a source of information, a partner to kind of weigh these pros and cons and really try to fully understand how this might help patients like you as you're considering participation or the broader community. So I think it's fair to say that we welcome questions as a research team and actually really enjoy hearing what motivates people.
Emily, I love the description of the Hawthorne effect. I wish it worked at home. The Hawthorne effect, the idea that when somebody's observing you, you behave better, that just doesn't seem to hold at my house, but maybe it's because people are watching all the time for my kids. But in general, what we've learned in research is that if people are knowing they're in a study and they're being watched, they take their medicines more, or the doctors behave in a way where it seems like people seem to get better outcomes.
Well, Manesh, you also have to remember the comparator, which is the behavior when you're not in the room. And I would say that is definitely worse, at least in my house.
Yeah, it may be true too. Maybe it's the opposite of the Hawthorne effect. Hear no evil, see no evil. I think what we learn from all of these programs is that we're often trying to learn from humans in their natural habitat. And that's a complicated scenario, right? And so we do these trials to say, how can we get as close to your lifestyle as possible? One of the things I've been really impressed with is how much people do want to get better and get access to innovation. And sometimes when it works, it really is transformative. Well, that was a really important discussion to keep having, and certainly something we will continue to think about and improve upon as we think about how do we provide information on research and how we can engage our community to do that. I want to thank you all for joining us for another episode of Beyond the Endpoint. I hope this mini-series helped to elucidate some things about clinical research participation. And as always, if you have any lingering questions, you can email us at beyondtheendpoint@duke.edu.
And if you missed our interview with Katie Ortman-Doble a couple of weeks ago, you can find that episode and some of the great resources that she shared on our website, dcri.org/BTE. See you next time.
This has been Beyond the Endpoint. Resources related to this episode are available on dcri.org/BTE. If you have any burning questions about clinical research or healthcare, drop us a line at beyondtheendpoint@duke.edu. We'd love to address your questions in a future episode.